Hello, everybody, and welcome to video lecture number 2 in the University of the Fraser Valley's online Mass Communications Theory course, Max 110. Once again, my name is David Christopher, your virtual instructor, and I will be spending most of the lecture today really reviewing the material from Chapter 1 now that we've entered into the course material itself. And the next lecture, which will also be posted this week, will take us into the material that is contemporary. Of course, the first reading, for which you have now already submitted your quiz question submissions, was based on Chapter 2 of the textbook, entitled Mass Communication Theory, Foundations, Ferment, and Future. And of course, the title of Chapter 2 was Establishing the Terms of the Debate over Media, the First Trend in Media Theory, Mass Society, and Propaganda Theories. And I'm going to walk you through some of the more important points that I think the rest of the course builds upon, and so it's necessary to have a good handle on them. And of course, I'll remind everybody that I will be referring to a PowerPoint presentation that is posted on the weekly materials in week 2 for the on the Blackboard LMS. You will find a link to this video, which you've obviously already found, as well as a PowerPoint presentation uploaded to the same weekly material. And I'll refer to slides as they're numbered in that PowerPoint presentation. And it will be a good idea, in fact, pretty much necessary, to follow along with those slides on your computer while I narrate them. And so that would have been slide number 1, and so I'll encourage everybody now to move on to slide number 2, which you can see is entitled Propaganda. Now, what the textbook outlines 3 types of propaganda. White propaganda, it refers to as the intentional suppression of potentially harmful information and ideas, combined with deliberate promotion of positive information or ideas in order to distract attention from problematic events. It refers to black propaganda, usually defined as involving deliberate and strategic transmission of lies to a media audience, which the textbook points out was used well and effectively by the Nazis in the build-up to World War II. And then it goes on to talk about gray propaganda, which involved the transmission of information that may or may not have been false. The point of gray propaganda was that it's similar to white propaganda in that it's promoting what an elite or powerful faction wanted the audience of media to be exposed to, and there was no effort to verify whether the information they were disseminating was factual or not. And the textbook tells us that in the post-World War I United States, when propaganda theory was originally developed, it said the beneficial use of propaganda, beneficial in terms of the elites that wanted certain ideas to be promoted, like a pro-war effort idea, was a term was coined by Edward Bernays called the engineering of consent. The engineering of consent. And that metaphor of engineering has to do with the point of capitalism at that point, the industrial, early 20th century industrial capitalism. Now, gradually, the textbook tells us the term propaganda came to refer to a certain type of communication strategy. It says it involves the no-holds-barred use of communication to propagate specific beliefs and expectations. And the ultimate goal of these propagandists, it says, is to change the way people act, and have them believe that this change in their behavior is actually because of their own impetus, to have them believe that the change was not motivated by some sort of media content, but was actually of their own decision. But what's interesting, the textbook also points out that propagandists, even in the United States, even in their benign or positive intents, they typically held elitist and paternalistic views about their audiences. They believed that people were generally foolish and needed to be converted to a dominant way of thinking for their own good. And this was listed on page 44. And that type of thinking, that top-down sort of social elitist thinking, gave rise to what I will invite you to look at in slide number 3 now. If you could switch to slide 3. And you'll see this one is entitled Mass Society Critics and the Debate Over Media. And the textbook tells us that conservative critics interpreted the rise of the media industries as very threatening. The media throughout history, every time a new type of media has been introduced, elites and conservative factions have seen it as very threatening to the status quo and threatened to subvert every other social institution, including political, religious, business, military, and educational institutions, is what the textbook tells us. And the textbook gives us an opportunity on page 33 to have a look at the box entitled Fearful Reactions to New Media, and it gives you an opportunity to consider how new media have been perceived. It invites you to go online or go to the library and find similar dire predictions about the internet and the web, but I don't think you need to go to the library. Really, you can do any sort of a Google search. It lists for example, when television was introduced, it adopted the name the boob tube because it was predicted that television would basically make the mass audience of television even stupider. They would not read. They would stop reading. They would stop remembering things. And the internet came with just as many apocalyptic prognostications about how it will bring down society, child pornography, online gambling, reduced literacy amongst young people using, for example, text speak, they call it, etc. Reduced attention spans and violent behaviors that would result from younger people having immediate access and exposure to pornographic or violent material that was not readily censored because of the nature of internet access. And the activity invites you to see if you can think of any other concerns associated with the coming of the new communication technologies. Have you ever been at your dinner table and heard your parents, perhaps, or revered older family members suggesting what it is about new media that will inevitably lead to the decay of society? Yeah, you're not required to do that activity, but it is fun. What is important is that the mass society theories that were developed, they make a number of basic assumptions, which are also listed on this slide. And I just want to go over those with you. They're significant assumptions that underpin thinking about media that exists even today as theory has developed. The first is that the media are a powerful force within society that can subvert essential norms and values and thus undermine the social order. And of course, this would require then this media threat must be brought under elite control. That is to say, powerful government factions or knowledgeable corporate factions or even intellectual factions represented by the universities. And in Europe, the textbook tells us this argument won out during the 1920s, and broadcast media were placed under the control of government agencies. And it does point out again that this type of policy had disastrous effects when Hitler won the election in Germany and his Nazi party used propaganda to help consolidate his power and really underpin and validate the persecution of Jews and the campaigns to invade Poland and other parts of Europe. In the United States, many schemes were proposed in the 1920s that would have turned control of broadcasting over to churches, schools, the textbook tells us, government agencies, and ultimately a compromise was reached and a free enterprise broadcasting industry was created. In Canada, we know that there was something of a hybrid where free enterprise was significantly bolstered and many times openly controlled by government factions because the population and the diversity and the spread was different in Canada. It was necessary for government to intervene in order to establish these industries in the early part of the 20th century. The second assumption is that media are able to directly influence the minds of average people, transforming their views of the social world, and this is also known as the direct effects assumption, which has been largely debunked, and yet obviously there's some validity to it because it remains current, having intellectual currency in modern debates. The third assumption is that once people's thinking is transformed by media, all sorts of bad long-term consequences are likely to result, ruining society and individuals. The fourth assumption, average people are vulnerable to media because in mass society, they are cut off and isolated from traditional social institutions that previously protected them from manipulation. And the problem here is with the term average people. This is an elitist assumption that members of this mass audience, this anonymous mass audience, would not have the intellectual faculties to filter information as well as an educated elite. The fifth assumption, social chaos would be initiated by media, and this would almost inevitably result in the same sort of totalitarian social order that existed under the German Nazis. And the sixth assumption, mass media inevitably debase higher forms of culture, bringing about a general decline in civilization. And this argument, again, quite elitist, dependent on a distinction between what is high culture, what is low culture. For example, it would debase people's appreciation of things like Mozart and encourage appreciation of things like The Simpsons. This leads us to sort of the contemporary application of these ideas. So I'll encourage you now to flip to slide number 4 in the PowerPoint presentation entitled Mass Culture. And we need to begin with the introduction of two terms introduced by Ferdinand Tönnies, Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. And in Tönnies' conception, Gemeinschaft was traditional folk cultures, and Gesellschaft was the modern industrial society, largely urban society. And what Tönnies was referring to was all of the ways in which these social orders were constructed, both economic and in terms of the family. And Emil Durkheim, he then makes some interesting assertions about these types of society. For Durkheim, folk culture was a mechanical culture, mechanical solidarity, he referred to it, in which people in the society were viewed as cogs in a machine. That mechanical metaphor refers to the fact that these identities were stable, and they didn't grow or change. There wasn't a lot of agency for members of the society. You were born into a caste, and you remained there economically and socially. He saw industrial society as being engendering a form of organic solidarity. And the metaphor here is that rather than being a machine in which people are stable cogs, people represent organs in a larger biological entity, and as the entity grows and changes, so too can people grow and change. So Durkheim's view of industrial society was quite idealistic. He felt that it allowed for more agency. And totalitarianism, in the early 20th century was the biggest fear aroused by these mass society theorists, but they also focused attention on a more subtle form of societal corruption, which they referred to as mass culture. We might think of mass culture as popular culture, obviously primarily disseminated through the media. And this mass culture theory, really, rather than it being elites concerned about the degrading of high culture, mass culture saw media and media content as degrading and undermining local cultures and even national identities. It's interesting that Roger Scruton, the textbook, points out his text, An Intelligent Person's Guide to Modern Culture, published in the year 2000. And he wrote, "Something new seems to be at work in the contemporary world, a process that is eating away the very heart of social life, not merely by putting salesmanship in place of moral virtue, but by putting everything, virtue included, on sale." And this is the idea that consumer culture will inevitably and fundamentally undermine more valuable, at least considered more valuable, aspects of social life, family life, and economic life. If you flip to slide 5 now, this introduces the idea of mass society theory in contemporary times. So how is it these mass culture and mass society theories are manifest today? This section starts on page 41 of your textbook, and it says that although mass society theory has little support among contemporary mass communications researchers and theorists, its basic assumptions of a corrupting media and a helpless audience have not disappeared. The textbook refers to Walter Lippmann. He's a nationally syndicated columnist for the New York Times. And Lippmann shared another theorist, Lasswell's skepticism about the ability of, again, average people to make sense of their social world and to make rational decisions about their actions. He described citizens in his 1925 book, The Phantom Public, this is Lasswell now, as a bewildered herd of ignorant and meddlesome outsiders who would be sidelined as interested spectators of action and no more. Not a very rewarding, not a description of members of the mass audience, and certainly elitist, a little bit top down. And this gives rise in current mass communications theory to a number of ideas that I'm not going to go over extensively now. You can see on the PowerPoint slide that I've given brief definitions for each of them. They'll come up more as we move through the textbook, but it's worth listing them. It's the agenda setting theory, the idea of the spiral of silence, cultivation analysis, and framing. And so I'll invite you to keep those terms handy as we move through and navigate the remaining reading responsibilities in the course. Framing is interesting. Its news conventions present a dominant interpretive background for understanding events and policies. It argues for a powerful public discourse shaping media. But I think a more simple way of understanding framing is that the media really only let us see part of the picture. They frame a certain depiction of events and ideas that is congruent with the power structures that are generating the media. And by letting us only see part of the picture, what they consider the good ideas or the saleable ideas, and maybe hiding the bad or corrupting ideas, it's similar in this way to white propaganda, which we looked at on the first slide. Now, if you can flip to slide 6 now, this gives us a little bit of more extensive theoretical background that the textbook trades on in explaining some of the mass society theories. This slide is entitled Behaviorism and Freudianism, and as the textbook tells us on page 46, most of the propaganda theories that developed during the 1930s were strongly influenced by the theories of behaviorism, and what they refer to as Freudianism, but which might more widely be understood as psychoanalysis. Freudianism assigns the body of theory to the primary theorist, although Freud was not the only person to develop theories of psychoanalysis throughout the 20th century. And it tells us that a theorist named John B. Watson is the primary driver behind the idea of behaviorism. Behaviorists argued that most human behavior is the result of conditioning by the external environment. We're conditioned to act in certain ways by positive stimuli or by negative stimuli. You may have heard those terms before, and the almost conventional example, the stereotype example, is that if you find a hot oven and you put your hand on the hot oven, you'll burn your hand. Ouch! And that is a negative stimuli, which will immediately teach you never to touch a hot element again. A positive stimuli is when you tell a joke and a bunch of people around you laugh and you become popular. That's a positive stimulus, which teaches you that humor has value in social settings. And this type of conditioning, behaviorism felt, was very direct. Behaviorists rejected psychology's widely held assumption that higher mental processes, conscious thought or reflection, control human action. It suggested that behavior was largely conditioned and we were responding in an impulse way to conditions rather than really thinking through our behavior. And this is similar to Freud's psychoanalysis, his basic model of psychoanalysis, which is readily understood through the image you see here, the iceberg metaphor. Basically, psychoanalysis suggests that human behavior is the product of the conflict between an individual's id, ego, and superego, between the deep unconscious and consciousness, which is what we are cognitively aware of, whereas the unconscious, we're not quite aware. And this unconscious is structured by these ideas of the ego, the id, and the superego. And the textbook doesn't do a really great job of explaining these, but for our purposes, it really is quite simple. In Freudianism, it says the ego is the rational mind. Effectively, the ego is what we are aware of. It's being awake, it's being conscious, although you can see from the iceberg metaphor image that part of the ego is just below the conscious surface in the preconscious, which is not entirely unaware to us. It's just not things we're immediately thinking about now. The id represents the unconscious, the primary portion of the unconscious. These are all of our early desires, sexual desires, desire for food, which largely we don't think about. And these motives occur underneath. They're always going on, according to Freud. They're very, very powerful, and they put constant pressure on the ego in ways that we're not aware of to behave in different ways. And then there's the superego, which sort of traverses, as you can see, the consciousness and the unconscious. And this is generally understood as the authority of parents, which is then transcribed as we mature into the authority of culture or cultural normativity or what is acceptable in culture, which affects both the unconscious and the ego. So if the superego is seen as an external force, and the id is seen as an entirely internal force, we might understand the ego as the portion of consciousness that attempts to mediate between them, but not in a way that we are particularly aware of. Now, the textbook tells us that in Lasswell's theory of propaganda, he borrowed ideas from both behaviorism and Freudianism into what the textbook says is a particularly pessimistic vision of media and their role in forging modern social orders. Lasswell thought that democracy was fundamentally flawed, that any discussion in the political arena moving towards a decision, even a democratic one, would result in social psychosis because it was fundamentally conflicted. And therefore, both Lippmann and Lasswell felt that media users need guidance from an educated elite, or what Lippmann referred to as a scientific technocracy, a sort of intellectual vanguard that could educate and lead the foolish masses through their use of media. What the textbook refers to the scientific technocracy as an educated social science-based elite charged with protecting vulnerable average people from harmful propaganda. And this drew Lasswell towards creating some new terms, including cultivation strategies, which would cultivate the proper or the good types of propagandistic thinking that the elites wanted through the development of master or collective symbols. And what's important here is rather than understanding media as having this sort of immediate propagandistic effect as behaviorism would suggest, as soon as we're subjected to something positive or negative, it will immediately change our thinking. Lasswell was clear that it was a slower process, that it required a long time, and yet it wasn't insignificant. That through the development of master symbols, ideas and concepts and images that were normalized over time in our society, that propaganda would have a significant effect on the way people thought, and this, again, disseminated primarily through media. Now, one significant critic of this type of thinking, the idea that an intellectual vanguard, a scientific technocracy was necessary to lead the foolish masses through their use of media, was a philosopher named John Dewey. He took a violent issue, it says in the textbook, with Lippmann's trust in the beneficence of elites. Dewey felt that the self-interestedness of powerful factions, corporate, government, or just elites, aristocratic even, would certainly not serve as appropriate guides to a proletariat class from which they were entirely separated. And Dewey felt that the solution was not an elite leadership, scientific or otherwise. He was a proponent of wider forms of education, a proponent of the idea of media education, that amongst math and literature, some of the education that should be basic to the education systems in North America it should be media as well. And of course, like this is an example of how that type of thinking has actually resulted in some changes to university curricula and different disciplines you might engage with. This also introduces the idea that newspapers should serve as vehicles for public education and debate, rather than as merely commercial reproduction of elite or consumerist ideas. They should focus more, according to Dewey, on ideas and philosophy, and less on descriptions of isolated events. And what we're going to learn in a later chapter is that one of the criticisms of modern news journalism is what's called fragmentation, how events are fragmented from their larger context in order to be saleable in sort of little digestible bits and pieces, which creates an artificial view and a biased view of the actual social fabric. Now, this also leads to the idea of the filters through which news journalism travels before it reaches the viewer. And so now I'll invite you to flip to slide number 7. As you can see, slide number 7 discusses a book penned by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in 2002 entitled Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of Mass Media, in which they introduced their propaganda model. And manufacturing consent obviously rings of Bernays' term from earlier in the century of engineering of consent. Engineering was an appropriate and timely metaphor for the industrial society of the era, whereas manufacturing might be a more relevant current metaphor. And in Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's book, they argue that there are 5 political, economic, and organizational filters that screen the U.S. news media to ensure that what we get on, for example, Fox News works in favor of political and economic elites. Now, the first of these filters is the concentration of ownership of the media in the hands of a few large private corporations. And the idea of ownership here is that if you are a media company that is owned by Coca-Cola or owned by Donald Trump, for example, if you are to criticize either of those factions in any of your investigative journalism, you might show up the next day to find that you've lost your job. It's never a good idea to publicly criticize the boss. And because media outlets, at least the big ones, are corporately owned, we're really going to only get a media that generates stories that are sort of in favor of the ownership. The second filter indicates that media is dependent on advertising as their principal source of revenue. And so, of course, if Coca-Cola is spending millions of dollars on 60 seconds worth of advertising, and you have an investigative report that criticizes Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola may pull their advertising. And if they do that, you lose your revenue stream, and losing your revenue stream can result in you actually closing your media company. But it's not just direct criticism, it's any anti-consumerist sentiment. For example, if you were to, on your broadcasting corporation, you were to have a documentary that was critical of capitalism or consumerist society in general, it's not likely that a company like Coca-Cola or a big corporation that depends on a positive idea of consumerism is going to advertise on that. Why would I advertise on a show that makes people feel bad about buying my product? The third filter that they identify is called sources. Now, because the cost of journalism is high, it's difficult for a media corporation to have journalists sort of everywhere in the world as news unfolds. And so they do rely on things like press conferences from large corporations or press conferences in the White House. And the problem is, if you then criticize, for example, Donald Trump in your press conference, he may kick you out of the press conference, leaving your media organization without direct access to these sources, even if the illusion is you're only reporting the sources objectively. The fourth filter is the filter of flack, which they define as negative feedback from powerful established interests when the news plays against their interests. So it's similar in this way to the idea of sources. For example, we have business organizations regularly come together to form flack machines. This idea is one in which if I criticize the Republicans, I may find that a Republican a political individual is friends with the owner of my company, and they call me up and they suggest that I'm fired. But more importantly, it has to do with credibility. As we know, journalism relies on sort of a mythology of being objective and being credible. And one example that's given in another text is the Global Climate Coalition, which is comprised of fossil fuel and automobile companies such as Exxon, Texaco, and Ford. And their whole mandate is to attack the credibility of climate scientists. Even though we have 95% or better of scientists globally talking on the same side, that the climate change is real, we still get in what is considered a fair or unbiased or a balanced report these types of discredit from companies like Global Climate Coalition. And the last filter is ideology. And Herman and Chomsky identify two forms of ideology. One of them is, again, common sense pro-capitalism, the idea that the market will save us all, it will distribute goods and services evenly, and that we are all lucky to be part of a consumer society. And the second one is fear, the idea when they were writing originally, when they wrote this, it was a Cold War fear, the fear of the communist infiltration of our country. And obviously after 9/11, while this fear has not gone away with the fall of the Soviet Union, it's just been transposed into a counterterrorism or the war on terror. And so it's easier, for example, to run a story that is highly Islamophobic than to run a story that is critical of consumerism or capitalism. Now, Robert McChesney, the textbook tells us, raises as sort of an added dimension to the idea of media ownership, the filter of media ownership, and that's that there's a myth of left bias in the media. And he says the fundamental error in the conservative notion of the liberal media is that it posits that editors and journalists have almost complete control over what goes into the news. That is to say, even if journalists had a left bias, which generally they don't, they certainly wouldn't be able to just create stories that went against the interests of the owners of the company that were dictating the content and deciding as gatekeepers what is presented to us in the media. And the second factor in contemporary rearticulations of mass society theory, the textbook tells us, involves the concentration of ownership of different media companies in fewer and fewer hands, an issue that will come up again later in later chapters. And that more or less concludes my brief summary of some of the more important ideas that I think are valuable in this chapter. Although I would like to draw your attention to the critical thinking questions, which are available on page 57, the last page of the required first reading. And I think the third question is interesting. And while, again, I don't expect you to respond to it in any formal sort of a way, it would be fun if you took the time to consider the question, can the traditional news media ever be truly liberal? Again, this question is on page 57, given their corporate ownership. Doesn't the now widely accepted view that the media failed the country in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq prove that they are anything but liberal? And why or why not? And what about the media's failure to detect the looming financial crisis that was about to nearly destroy the global economy? That's referring to the early 21st century financial crisis. And wouldn't a media with an anti-corporate bias, that is a liberal media, have been more vigilant? And I think it's worth considering. On a simpler note, perhaps, does the media, in your opinion, have a left or a liberal bias, or is it fundamentally conservative, although that conservatism is hidden behind the filters identified by Herman and Chomsky? And so, once again, Thanks for taking the time to review this second lecture, survey material of the first reading, and in a day or two I'll post the next video lecture and accompanying PowerPoint on the reading that is required for this week. Thanks very much for your quiz question submissions. Most of them were excellent, and I will look forward to reading the next ones after the following Sunday. Have a great week.